Sorry, but yeah. Is it yeah, no, yeah. Yeah.
Does that do anything on there? No. Okay, perfect. All right, see. I know I probably don't need the microphone in here, but might save my voice a little bit, especially since I just made this tea, so it is scaldingly hot, so I can't drink it for a while. And this Yeti cup is far too good at keeping in the temperature, so I take the lid off and let it cool off. Otherwise, I'll take one sip halfway through the class and die, just like drinking hot lava. Um, silly. It was a gift from a student, and it's lovely. I love it. Also, it's red, and I love red. But it is far, far too good at keeping hot drinks hot and cold drinks cold. Okay, so welcome back to Sociology 377. Obviously, we are once again talking sociology of youth. Last time we, kind of introduced the course. Um, we talked about some of the history of youth and childhood, really from like, the Middle Ages all the way up to kind of the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. And today we're going to pick up kind of the topic, talking about what life was like for our or four or five, six, I think we said six living generations, right? The silence, we're now very old, but their life experiences are really interesting and really important. And then the boomers, Gen X, millennials, Gen Z, and a little bit of preliminary data on Gen Alpha. Okay, I forgot to turn my subtitles on. Starting subtitles now. Let's go. Okay, so same as last time. If you have any questions, do feel free to put them into here. Right. So any questions about the course? I didn't really keep an eye on Bear Tracks yesterday to see if people jumped in and out of the course. So I'm not sure. But if you have any questions about the course, as always, you can raise your hand in class and ask the questions. Or if you're too shy, right, you can use this, which is Slido, to enter your questions in, right? Just either scan this QR code on your phone or go to slido.com and enter the code 3603121. Okay, so we're going to talk about our generations. All right, so most of the information from this book I'm taking in this unit, I'm taking from this book, which is Generations by Jean Twenge. And you'll probably hear that name a whole bunch of times as we go through the course. Twenge's emerged as a really interesting figure since about 2017. She wrote a book called iGen, about Gen Z, and specifically about how technology was affecting them. And she has sort of become, I would say, as far as academics go, a sort of minor celebrity among academics. Right, she's super in demand, in terms of speaking at conferences, and her work is now really, really widely recognized. And she is a generational researcher. This is what she kind of cut her teeth on, at San Diego State University. And she started writing, initially when she was doing her PhD on her own generation. And Twenge is Gen X. Oop, you're going to do that to me again, aren't you? Twenge is Gen X, right? And we'll talk about where these generations fall as we go through. So she started talking about Gen X, and then she moved on to talking about millennials. No, no worries. Happened to me yesterday. I was at my kid's concert and my alarm went off and I couldn't figure out how to shut it off. So happens to the best of us. It was very, and I'm sure I annoyed people around me. Um, but it was not a big deal. Okay. Nor is this a big deal. All right. What was I saying? Oh yeah, she's rather rude about millennials. She wrote two books on millennials. One called The Narcissism Epidemic, about millennials, and one called Generation Me, about how millennials are also self-centered. So like I said, rather rude. And she became really famous though for her book on Gen Z, which she called iGen, right? So iGen, and we'll see this term again as we go through. Why there specifically? I don't know how to make an E backwards. Okay. I'm gonna write it down here. iGen. I've never figured this out. And my many searches of why does that particular pen movement at the top of the slide switch me out of my slideshow has given me nothing. Okay. iGen, right? Basically taking that same convention from Apple's naming convention for a lot of its devices, right? The iMac, um, iPhone, and iPad, where the I stands for internet. And she wanted to popularize iGen as the name of Gen Z, but it never really caught on, for whatever reason. People have stuck with Gen Z. Okay. Is Gen Alpha doomed with the state of the world right now? I mean, I don't think. I don't think any. I think every generation thinks they're kind of doomed, in a sense, right? There's always, kind of pessimism that goes on. I actually see a lot of things in Gen Alpha that I think are quite optimistic. Where I think Gen Z has faced a lot of really deep problems. I think Gen Alpha, in some ways, are resistant to those problems, and some of the parenting has adapted, when it comes, say, to the technological environment when it comes to Gen Alpha. So I'm like kind of hopeful about it, to be honest. That said, I've been wrong before and frequently. Um, but are they gonna face challenges? Yes. Are they doomed? No, I don't think so. We will always find a way to muddle through, no matter how ugly it is. Why? I wonder why older generation. Oops. Okay, I don't know why that is now there. Let me go back. There we go. I don't know. I wonder why older generations tend to greatly dislike younger generations. Gen X hating millennials, millennials hating Gen Z, Gen Z hating Gen Alpha. I think it's just like if you want to go back to it, right? You can read Aristotle and you can read like Socrates, and there's still, and Plato, and there's like, those darn kids, right? It's back in like Greek antiquity. There are things like, the youth, they're so shiftless and they don't understand our values, right? This seems to be almost like a universal part of the human condition for whatever reason. Okay, so let's talk about this. All right. Now, like I said, Twenge is a generational researcher. In this book, she argues for what she calls a technology model of generations. And I really like this. One, I think because I sort of intellectually cut my teeth on people like Neil Postman, Harold Innis, and Marshall McLuhan, who are all kind of in this school saying technology has really deep effects on human beings, right? So I always find this kind of model really interesting, and it's a little bit technologically determinist, which some people don't like. about Twenge, but I happen to like it quite a bit. But what she suggests is that each generation is ultimately defined by the technological conditions it experiences in its formative years, right? Typically when they are teenagers or when they are in their early 20s, right? What we'll see is as we go through this and as we talk about the different generations, we're going to talk about different technologies that were sort of preeminent when they were young. Now, some of these technologies you're going to see a few times, right? Like television is particularly important for basically like the silence, the boomers, Gen X, a little bit less for millennials. But TV kind of carries through, but the context of TV gets to be a little bit different as that technology changes. So just be kind of cognizant of that as we're looking at it. Okay. And technology, I think no one should be surprised about this, affects, all sorts of aspects of life, family, education, work, leisure, right? What we do for fun has changed enormously. Another person I'm going to mention a lot through the course is Robert Putnam. He wrote this book he wrote it in the 90s called or 1990s called Bowling Alone, about how cable television had gutted things like the bowling league, right? So technology really changes the way we spend our leisure time. Religion, politics, mental health. I have a whole unit at the end on mental health. So this kind of carries through. And new technologies will create generation gaps, specifically because, whatever generation are the parents of the people going, through their teens and 20s in a new technological context, grew up in a different one. And the new technological context really, I don't want to say confuses them, but they didn't grow up in it, so they're affected by it in a different way. So they have different understandings of the technological environment, right? So some of the, why do older generations tend to hate younger generations? Which I don't think is true. I think they have complaints about it. But a lot of it is, you probably had your parents tell you as you were going off, to put down that screen and go outside, right? Because they grew up in a different technological context where there were different norms, right? Gen X is notorious for this, particularly. All right, now this one I think is interesting. Obviously, technological change is accelerating, right? We've moved through different technological contexts really, really quickly, right? I would say the silence had a long time to kind of get used to television before the next big technology showed up. Something like the iPhone, shows up and like consumer smartphones show up in 2007, right? And less than 20 years later, we're getting another big technological kind of revolution in something like AI. Now, you can ask me about AI if you want. I really have such mixed thoughts about it. I either think it's going to be the biggest thing ever or it's going to be a complete nothing burger, depending on which day of the week I happen to be on, and in like how much sleep I got. I can't make up my mind about AI. But the pace of technological change is accelerating quite a bit. So what she says is our generations, right, are going to get shorter and shorter because, there's the technologies are less consistent over time. Okay. All right. One more big concept, and then we're going to get to the silence. One of the other concepts that she kind of works with is what she calls life history theory. And I think this one, is important to think about because I think it explains a lot of what has happened to our, in terms of changes culturally to our young people, is a shift from one kind of life history or way of going through life to another, right? So, basically, what she suggests is that when you're raising your kids, you sort of have two choices to make as a parent. And now these are not necessarily choices that you make like, you know that these two choices exist and you choose between both of them. They're more culturally dictated, right? Based on what's going on in the culture. So, the one that has been sort of the normal life strategy for most of human history is what we'll call the fast, or what Twenge calls it, no, what we'll call the fast life strategy, right? And basically, in a fast life strategy, the idea is to raise kids so that they become relatively independent quite quickly, right? So that they're less dependent on their parents. Now, this tends to be common when there's really high adult and infant mortality, right? As was the case in most of human history, really before 1800, right? When modern medicine really starts to kick off and extend lifespans and lower both maternal, particularly, and infant mortality rates. So yeah, you tend to see, and again, you'll see this in places in the world that still have high infant and there's still places in you know poor parts of the world today where the fast life strategy would still be the one that's most common because you would still have high infant and especially maternal mortality. So more common when you have high risk of death. And yeah, you tend to, in a fast life strategy, sort of roll the dice and have many children, hoping that they will, a few of them will make it past their fifth birthday. Because, most typically, without modern medicine, antibiotics, and all of these things, a lot of children die before their fifth birthday as their immune system sort of develops. Okay. More children had earlier, right? Oh, yeah. And you would tend to have your kids quite young, right? You're probably looking at, having children in your late teens to early, or starting to have children in your late teens to early 20s. So you have them much earlier and you want them to be self-sufficient before one or both parents die, right? Okay, to compare, right? 1800, infant mortality was about 1 in 6. So one of every 6 babies died before their first birthday. In 2020, it's less than 1 in 200 in the United States. And there are places in the world, right? If we look at, like France, Switzerland, Finland, where it's even lower than that, right? It's closer to 1 in 350, right? So very low infant mortality rates. Okay. And like I said, this has been the typical parental strategy and the way human life was organized for most of human history, right? Because until we get industrialization and modern medicine, early parental death was and high infant mortality was sort of the norm for human life. Okay. The other strategy, which we will call the slow life strategy. So what happens is, in an environment where you have less adult and less infant mortality, people typically start having children later. There's a longer period of preparation for adulthood. And, they tend to expect them to grow up more slowly, right? Rather than being self-sufficient relatively early, we expect that their parents are going to be around so they don't have to be self-sufficient nearly as quickly, right? Education will typically take quite a bit longer. And like you talked about last time, right? We're moving into an environment where, education is now going to consume probably a good fifth, either a quarter, right? If we're talking an average lifespan being about 80 years, or if we think, humans are probably going to start living to around 100 and beyond, a good fifth of that is probably going to be spent in education for a lot of people in the industrialized world. Now, there are good things about this world, right? Lower mortality is good. But one of the things that tends to, be true of kind of industrialized modern countries is that, and especially late or what's the term that I saw yesterday? High modern societies, right? Late modern or high modern societies is that they are incredibly competitive environments, right? In terms of securing economic resources for you and making sure your children secure those resources for themselves, it is increasingly difficult, right? There's more competition, economies become more complex. And so if you're going to do really, really well, and we'll see that when we talk about education later in the course, you typically will require a bunch more education, right? Falling behind is a relatively big risk, right? Not getting a job, going into a career path or a job path that doesn't pay well. These are all things that tend to be true of high modernity or late modernity, whichever term you prefer. All right. So what happens? Parents have fewer children, right? And here, right? I'll put it this way. Here, children tend to be a general economic plus, right, in a fast life strategy, because you're often talking about agrarian societies where children are extra workers, right, on your family farm that you don't have to pay. Whereas in kind of late modern societies, children in a lot of cases are an economic kind of drain, right? They're going to consume a lot of resources as you get them to maturity. And so people, everybody has limited resources. People tend to choose to have fewer children because they know they're going to have to invest a lot of resources in those children, right? And they nurture them more extensively, right? Not surprisingly, what we've seen in kind of late, the end of the 20th century, the beginning of the 21st, I guess the first quarter of the 21st century. That makes me feel so old. I remember when the 21st century was brand new. I actually watched, the year 2000 celebrations on TV and all that fun stuff. And that makes me feel old that was, a quarter century ago. Whatever. In the last kind of quarter of the 20th and first quarter of the 21st century, what we've seen is an intensification of parenting, right? And much closer relationships between parents and children, right? Parents tend to be much more involved in their kids' lives and directing them to a much greater degree. And yeah, what we see is a considerable competition for scarce resources, due to say things like income inequality, growing more automation, globalization, all sorts of things that disrupt economies. And so what that leads to is way fewer children and way more investment of parental resources in hopes that they will succeed, right? So you might think of, in a sense, the fast life strategy as kind of quick and cheap, and the slow life strategy as long and expensive, right? These are different ways of kind of thinking about it. Okay, hang on, let me go back to questions. No questions, perfect. All right, so with that in mind, right, we're going to talk about our different generations. I'm going to see if my tea is cold enough to drink. Not quite. Okay, so the silence, right? Now, our silent generation, roughly speaking, is born between 1925 and 1945, right? So kind of in the, here in the interwar period, right? We got our interwar, between the First and Second World Wars through till the, kind of end of World War II. This is kind of the cultural context into which they are born. So obviously that's a big range, right? That's a 20-year range. And some of those experiences are going to be very different. Some of them will, have experienced, say, the Great Depression, much more than those born later in the kind of silent generation. Okay. For a lot of really interesting cultural reasons, one of which we'll explain when we talk about the boom. Well, we'll explain when we talk about the silence and how many children they had, and their children largely are the baby boomers. The boomers are a super significant kind of generational cohort for a lot of reasons. And so we often forget the silence, right? And yeah, they're kind of wedged between two really kind of, I guess, important generation. The greatest generation, right? So the greatest generation are the ones who have actually fought largely in the Second World War, right? And they're given the name greatest generation because of the sacrifices they made during that war. And the boomers, right? And again, the boomers we won't talk about the greatest generation because there's really none of them left at this point. The boomers, lots of them still around, and they have a huge cultural impact that continues on today. I mean, if you want just even kind of contemporary, kind of Canadian evidence that the boomers remain important, the boomers were the one generational cohort that really came out in favor, like in vast majority favor of Mark Carney and the Liberals in the last election, And their power culturally and from a voting perspective is so great that they actually shifted the whole election in favor of the liberals, right? Where it looked like before, we're going to get a conservative government. But, the boomers really went hard for Mark Carney, so they still have a lot of cultural power. Okay, but we're not talking about them just yet. We're talking about the silence. Okay, so the silence, you think here typically the biggest cultural impact that people are going to have is sort of in their late teens through till about, their 30s, right? That's when they're kind of most culturally active before they settle down, when they're in their most kind of culturally dynamic phase, right? Before they sell out, if you will. And one of the things that's true is we often associate, the counterculture and all the shifts that happen with things like feminism, right, or the women's liberation movement, the civil rights movement, anti-war movements, especially movements against the Vietnam War with the baby boomers. But in large part, what's often attributed to the baby boomers was actually driven by the silence, right? They're actually the genesis point. All right, so this period, 1963 to 1970, is one of really intense cultural change, right? And a lot of the movements that would categorize, later generations and cultural changes in later generations happened specifically in the late 1960s and the beginning of the 1970s. But a lot of this is not actually driven by the boomers. The boomers were too young. It's driven by the silence, right? So like feminism, civil rights, gay rights, which eventually morphs into the LGBTQ movement, right? These are all things that find their roots in the late 60s and 70s when the silents are, in their 20s and 30s, right? So they're in their, say, college and early adult years. And again, those are our kind of most dynamic years culturally. And yeah, lots of the leaders of the counterculture movement were silenced, right? So, Maria Savio, a labor rights kind of organizer, Abby Hoffman, feminist, and Gloria Steinem, also a feminist, right, are born right in the middle of that kind of silent generation, right? And so they're coming of age after the Second World War, right? So they would have been around 10 years old at the end of, especially Hoffman and Steinem are about 10 years old when the Second World War ends, right? So they're moving into their 20s about, a decade after that. Okay. So, lots of technological change that the silence lived through. And I know, like, both of my parents are sort of early on in the boomers, right? My dad's born in 1947, my mom in 1951. So they remember, their parents who were silent generation. And my dad always says of my paternal grandmother, right, that she lived through, kind of changes all the way from, basically when they were farming with a horse-driven plow all the way through, right? She lived long enough. She didn't have one, but she saw the transformation of the world with iPhones and satellite TV and all of these things, right? So they lived through a lot of technological change, and a lot of change, especially in communications technology, happens in the post-war period. So the big one for the silence is probably television, right? TV comes on the scene as a major consumer technology in the 1950s. Television had been around prior to that as early as the 1930s, but the technology wasn't mature enough to be a real consumer product until the 1950s. And 1952 is a big year, in terms of television, because it really replaces radio as the consumer product and the consumer product that people want at the center of their homes, right? If you went back prior to 1952, in the kind of living room of the average kind of American or Canadian home, you would have had a big radio, right? In the 50s, that starts to be replaced by a television, right? And it is an important piece of technology, right? It kind of brings the world to people's living rooms, right? And allows people to see all sorts of things happening in the world, from the comfort of their own homes, and often in a less mediated way than had been the case in the past, right? In the past, right, for say seeing footage of what was happening in the Second World War, people would have gone to the cinema, right? And there would have been newsreels playing before movies. Now those newsreels increasingly come home into the home, right? And there's less time between when things are filmed and when they show up on television. This becomes especially important during, say, the Vietnam War, right? Korea is a little bit too early. The Korean War, if I think I'm correct on this, is 1950 to 1953. That one's a little, that's, the Korean War, that one's too early. But by the time we get to the Vietnam War, people are going to be experiencing a lot of things that are happening in Vietnam in their own living rooms, right? It's coming into their homes. So they see it in a very different way. And I think it's worth saying their reaction to these two wars culturally is very different. Almost no one opposed the Korean War, but there's a huge anti-war movement against the Vietnam War. Okay, jet travel, right? So you get your first kind of commercial jets in the post-war era. That makes the world not physically a smaller place, but it shrinks the world in really important ways, right? It's suddenly possible to get into an airplane and go to Europe or go to Asia much more quickly, right? So people start to travel more and experience more parts of the world. And space travel, right? The space age starts really in the 1950s, really picks up. We get the launch of the first satellites at the end of the 1950s, first by the Soviet Union, then by the United States. But then you get, the space race. By 1969, the Americans have put people on the moon, right? And all of this shrinks the world in other ways, right? Just from a sense of perception, right? You get a lot of talk from people like John F. Kennedy about, and reflecting on what the astronauts have seen from space, that, Earth is just this tiny blue planet in a sea of black. But also satellite communication makes it possible to communicate globally much more easily as well, in ways that we take for granted, right? Prior to this, there were undersea telegraph cables, but there were limits on what you can communicate on those undersea telegraph cables, right? If you're sending telegrams, they were quite limited in what you could actually send. Okay. Now, I'm going to actually change colors here because the next few things are really, really important. What color should I choose? I'll go with green. Okay. The economy. The economy shifts in major ways as well, right? And ways that are very, very significant for women in particular. And we get a shift away from manual labor, right? Now, manual labor is going to be important for a really long time. Right, we still have manufacturing as a big part, and construction and resource extraction as big parts of the economy for a while. Manual labor tends to prize strength, right? Manufacturing, construction, resource extraction are all things that tend to be, very dependent on physical strength in lots of ways. And this is something that tends to favor men economically, right? So men had been in a lot of the best paying positions up to this point because, the way the economy was structured, it was structurally kind of benefiting or structured around male attributes like strength. What happens, starting in the 1960s and then continuing on to today is we get the growth of the service economy, right? And the service economy does not really focus on strength, is much more focused on interpersonal skills, right? In large part, but other administrative skills and people skills and those sorts of things. It's less based in strength. And so that economy starts to really favor women or include women in much more total ways, right? And we'll get a shift, kind of from the middle part of the 20th century to the end of the 20th century, where basically we go from a world where, in 1950, about 80% of the economy was manufacturing, resource extraction, construction, and agriculture, right? Meaning the service part of the economy was only 20%. And these numbers by the end of the 20th century, right? So by the time we hit the year 2000, these numbers have basically flipped, right? Where about 20% of the economy. Okay. Whoop, whoop. Okay. Guess I can't get that. There we go. We're going to do dots. 20% of the economy was in those. Now just lines are getting me. All right. I give up. 20% is manufacturing, and about 80%, is in the service industry, right? So basically we have a flip, right? And we'll talk about this throughout the course. We'll talk about this when we go to work, when we talk about work, when we talk about, the boy and man crisis later on in the course. These changes structurally in the economy have real implications for both men and women. It opens a lot of opportunities for women to enter the workforce, and they do. And for men, it means that there are fewer opportunities. And so a lot of men, again, we'll talk about this later in the course, fall out of the labor market or struggle to do really well in the labor market. And from the 1970s forward, median wages for men basically stall, right? In terms of if you compare them to cost of living, men's wages basically haven't gone up since about 1978, whereas women's wages have shot forward. Okay, so we have this change in the economy away from manual labor, or primary and secondary industries to tertiary industries, and that tends to favor women, and a lot more women enter the workforce. Okay, individuality and individualism grows as well. You get this very slow change, and again, this takes multiple generations. But it's important as well, right? You start to get this shift away from the idea of, a social order dominated by social rules and duties to one that's dominated by individual rights. And you kind of see this, right? If you've ever heard some of Kennedy's speeches or John F. Kennedy's speeches, right? He'll say things like, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country, right? That's kind of an idea of social rules and duties. But today, the discourse is dominated almost entirely by questions of individual rights. And this starts with the silent generation, right? They're the ones who start to advocate more for individual rights, and their mentality changes from one that prizes, cohesion and sort of more communitarian or collective ideas towards more individualistic ones, right? All right. In the early 1960s, Black and white people in the U.S. South, just as an example, were segregated, right? They had separate institutions, separate bathrooms, separate water fountains. Black people couldn't eat at the same lunch counters as white people could. And women were, actively discriminated against in various professions. By the 1970s, this has all started to change, right? Or begun to change. It's not complete, right? But the seeds of what will come later are all set basically by the time the last of the silents enter their 30s. Okay, and our later born silents, right? So those born more towards the 1940s, or maybe I should write it down here, the 1940s, are the first ones who really have an experience of a large plurality of their mothers working when they were school-aged, right? So about a third of women return to work, right, once their last child has sort of gone off to school, right? So they're the first to experience this, right? Now, again, it's not a majority. It's just a plurality, right? About a third. Okay. All right, my tea has sufficiently cooled. Wow, how 41 minutes flies. For me, I don't know about you. I'm excited. I always like this stuff. All right. I like charts too. If you ever come and take SOC of Religion with me, or if you have, you'll realize my deep love of charts. Painfully so at times for students, but I love charts. Okay, so our silence. Our silence. There's my box. All right, our silence. What do we got? Well, they get married pretty early, right? Even by the standards of the generational cohorts that came before them, the silents get married quite young, right? And if you see here, right, and I love my charts, the age at first, so this is age at first marriage or median age at first marriage, right? If we go back to 1900, right, the median age at first marriage was relatively high by historical standards, right? For men, it was 26. For women, just a hair under 22 years old. And it starts to drop, thereafter, right? By the time we hit the beginning of the silence, your median age at first marriage for men is about 24. For women, it's about 21. And then it dips well below that, right? Whereas, it kind of bumps around in the, around 20 years old. For most of that time, the silence are between ages 18 and 25, right? Before spiking upwards again, right? By the time we hit the 1980s, we're almost back to where we were at the beginning of the 20th century for men, and women are basically back at that point. And these numbers have continued to rise, right? If we go for men, it's about 30 now, and for women, the average age at first marriage is about 28. So relatively late by historical standards. Okay, this one I always find this one interesting. Yeah, the silents basically married younger than any other generation born in the 20th century, right? So the silents are a huge outlier in this respect. They got married earlier than the people who came before them, and they will get married earlier than the people who come after them as well, right? And it hits an all-time low of an average, right, of 20.1 in 1956, which means you got a whole lot of people below that number, right? Because that is the median. This one I always find wild. Nearly half of the women getting married in the 1950s were teenagers. Now, by and large, these are girls, between 17 and 19, right? So we're not talking about a ton of like 15 and 16-year-olds getting married, right? That was still relatively uncommon. But, girls who had basically graduated from high school and were on the cusp of adulthood or who had just become adults made up about half of all of the women getting married in the 1950s. And I always, I always think of this in the context, like basically half the women in this room would have been married right out of high school, right? Which is clearly not the case anymore. But yeah, if you had a class of undergrads, half of them would have been married, right? And of the women, anyway. All right, most of them, meet their spouses either in college or in high school, right? And get married immediately after graduation, right? So for those marrying who are 17 to 19, largely they're getting married out of high school, right? And marrying someone they met in high school. Again, a wild thought. Would any of you want to marry the boys you knew in high school at this point? Consider that, right? Um, Different times. You laugh. Like, no. What an insane thing to do. Very different cultural standards today, right? We'll talk about that when we talk about marriage later in the course. It's fun. Right, and those, who didn't are probably getting married either in college or right after they graduate from college. So somewhere around 21, 22, right, would have made up the bulk of the other people getting married. And why did they do that? Well, it was the cultural norm, right? Essentially, we can talk about, cultural scripts and social scripts. And though we all love to think that we are wonderfully independent people, who make up our own minds about things. And, the tendency, and this is true, especially starting with millennials, that we aren't affected by the rest of the culture. We are basically just, these perfectly voluntaristic beings who make up our own minds about everything. We aren't, right? You tend to do the things that the people around you are doing, right? And this is true today, right? Your values and your beliefs about when you should get married, when you should have kids are largely shaped by the surrounding culture. So you're less free than you think you are. The norm for the silence was to get married early and to have kids relatively early as well. And conformity, I think, was a more important value to the silence maybe than it is today. But I think you're no less shaped, and I'm no less shaped by our cultural surroundings than anyone else. Okay. Now this one is wild. Where do I have my number? Oh. Okay. I'm going to remember this number. 76 million. I always forget the exact number and I go too high. The Silents have a lot of babies, right? The reason that the next generation is called the baby boomers is because it's kind of a demographic explosion, right? And that's this big, tall spike right here. So this is the Silents are having children. Those children are the baby boomers. Now, the baby boomers are named because they were the boom, right? Not because they were the ones who had a lot of children. Once we get out of the silence, things kind of drop off. The baby boomers have way fewer children than the silence did, right? So people sometimes get this mixed up and think the boomers had a lot of kids, which is why I'm stressing this point. The ones that had a lot of kids were the silence, right? They brought the boom. Okay. So it's a little bit of a weird thing because when we talk about the silence, the actual families they tended to come from were relatively small, right? The most common family form was two-child families, right? So really similar to what we see today, right? That the world is kind of built now for, a family of four. Well, the families that the silence came from were families of four by and large. And yeah, the total fertility rate prior to the Great Depression was somewhere around 2.5 children per woman, right? So that's, kind of in this range. Up and down, around and right. We see the Great Depression here drops fertility a bit. But overall, right, prior to the silence, it's about 2.5 children per woman. Now, that's if you don't understand how total fertility works, or total fertility rates kind of work and are calculated, basically, maintenance population, so just to keep your population at the same, is 2.1 children per woman, roughly, in an industrialized society with low infant mortality. So roughly speaking, 2.1 children per woman is what you need to keep your population steady. Anything above that, right, and you'll tend to see population growth. And historically, since the invention of modern medicine, it's hovered right around, kind of 2.3, 2.5 until you get birth control, and that's a whole other story. But what happens with the silence is their fertility goes up hugely, right? To around, at a peak, I guess the peak is right here. 3.8 children per woman in 1958, right? So that is a lot above replacement fertility. So what you see is a huge population spike or a boom, right? Why we call them the baby boomers? Because there was a boom of babies. And as I show on that other slide, in this period where the boomers are having children, 76 million babies are born in America. In Canada, it's about 8 million. Right? And Canada was a country of about 23 or 24 million people at the time. So you added almost half the population, right? not quite, but a huge boom, right? And the same thing in the United States, right? That 76 million is a population explosion. And yeah, it doesn't return to that average kind of fertility that was in the first half of the 20th century until 1968, right? At which point it then, so that's right about here. And then it continues to dive, right? And it dives below replacement fertility. I can't remember the year in the United States. In Canada, fertility drops below replacement fertility in 1976 and has never gone back above replacement fertility since then. We've consistently been below replacement fertility. Okay, so they have lots of kids, and old cultural standards kind of hold, right? If you want to talk patriarchy and why so many of the silents come to feel trapped in domestic roles, a lot of it is because of this. They're still expected to do the bulk of domestic tasks, right? Cleaning, cooking, care for children and elders, even whether or not they worked, full time or part time. So a lot of these women do go back to work when they have young children. Most typically, when their last child goes to school, right, and is in full time schooling, they go back to work. But then, they're still expected to do the bulk of domestic labor in what feminists, ended up calling either the double day or the second shift, right? They went to work and they worked a shift and they came home and worked another shift, and their husbands were far less involved in domestic tasks than their wives were. Okay. So, now, the silence, oops, love that. The silence. So they remain connected. So they're quite socially connected, right? They were deeply engaged in institutional life, right? So they were highly engaged in things like community leagues, churches, civic organizations, political activists and political party groups, all sorts of things. And interestingly, they have been remarkably resilient to anxiety over their life course, right? So our black line is people born 1945 and before, so that's our silence. And the other line is our people born after 1946, and this is rates of anxiety and depression. Amber alert. This is a test. Okay, we're all gonna do this. Just waiting. How do you make them not make loud, annoying sounds? All right, let's go. I'm just waiting for the next phone to make the Amber Alert sound. Okay, so they've generally been more connected socially to civic organizations and family through their life course, and it seems to have paid in dividends of lower rates of isolation, depression, and self-harm, including suicides, especially compared to later generations. And it may simply be that their larger families, as they move through, they had more kids, so they had more connection to those kids. More people checking in on them, more people talking to them, interacting with them on a regular basis as they went through the life course and as especially they got older. Okay. Why were they called the silence? This is a good question. Why are they called the silence if they were more politically proactive compared to previous and later generations? I think the reason that they are called silence, it's largely a misnomer, right? So it's largely a perception that they are less politically active than cohorts that come later, even though they really aren't, right? There's sometimes also, they're also sometimes called the lucky generation. And we'll talk about why as we go through the course. I almost think all good. It's all fun. Lucky in the sense that they didn't have to serve in the Second World War, right? So they I knew it was coming. Apparently, my phone carrier is way more with it than yours is. Um, they didn't have to serve in the Second World War, and they also lived through a really long, sustained economic boom, right? They do really, really well, as do the boomers, because there's this post war economic boom that runs basically from 1945 until 1973, right? So they get into the economy and live a good part of their working lives during this economic boom. Afterwards, right, generations like the boomers, but especially Gen X, come into a much different and much worse economic system. So yeah, they're called the silents, and I think there's this perception that they didn't do much. They were quiet. They just went along with everything. They really didn't. But a lot of their achievements and a lot of the things they started are picked up by the baby boomers, and the boomers take it to the next stage, which is why the boomers get credited with so much. So yeah, I think the silent is largely a misnomer at the end of the day. Okay. Is there a reason why the four child family became a popular format for silence? Now that's just average fertility, right? Like total fertility rate. So there's a lot of people above that, right? Like there's a lot of 5, 6, 7 person families. A lot of kids were had in this period. I think it's a mix of sort of the cultural norms, right? A lot, people will put it down to the fact that people felt really optimistic in this period. There's a lot of other things that happened. One of them was people moved out of the inner city, right? So they moved out of urban cores where people tend to live in relatively small apartments, which does tend to limit how many children people have because you just don't have the space for them, right? Most people don't want to stack their children like cordwood. Or crates or whatever metaphor you want to use, they moved out to the suburbs into these somewhat larger homes that had a little bit more space and yards. And so there was this optimism, right? The physical space changed. Everyone was doing it. And there was a lot of optimism, right? You're living through this sustained economic boom where all of a sudden it's possible for, and it almost hadn't been possible prior to this, for the husband to go off to work and make enough in that really booming manufacturing economy to support, wife and however many kids were at home. And all of that has a sort of cultural force, right? When you see people around you having 3, 4 kids, you think that's the norm and you're much more likely to do so, right? You're affected by the people around you. So I think it's just like, oh, some people hate this word in sociology. I'm going to use it anyway. The zeitgeist, right? I'm just reading a book now about how we should rehabilitate the idea of a zeitgeist when it comes to sociology, which I do think is interesting. But there is this kind of zeitgeist, right, or kind of cultural forces that push people in a particular direction. Were second families more common with these economic conditions? By second families, I presume you mean where someone was running off and having a second family on the side? Or is there another meaning to second family that this is like the Twitter or Reddit stories version, maybe that's in my head. I mean, I'll say, very stable time, high rates of marriage, very low rates of divorce, relatively low rates of infidelity, right? And pretty strict social punishment for those who did stray. Um, that said, right, there are sort of second or blended families that do happen, but it's not the norm, right? Okay. So, 2 o'clock. Let's go for another 20 or so minutes, then we'll take a break. The boomers. Okay. So this is, I would say one of the more consequential generations ever to be born. Certainly in our lifetime, or not in our lifetime, in our kind of recent history, right? In the past 100 years of kind of the history of places like the US and Canada, they have been massively impactful, right? And yeah, it starts kind of as the Second World War ends. right? Soldiers start to come back from the war, high rates of marriage, prolonged economic boom. And with that comes, this very long and sustained demographic bulge, right? And again, that's this. That's what demographers would call a bulge, right? But it's also this, right? So this is 1970, its population in millions. The boomers are down here, right? So they are a big kind of, fat area of our demographic pyramid. Um, and yeah, so the baby boomers, right? By the time that ends, right around the end of the 1960s, in the US, 76 million babies had been born, right? Which again, to put it in context, that's like twice the or not, I guess Canada's closer to 40 million now. It's almost twice the population of Canada, just, in a 15 to 20 year period being born, more than the entire population of France today and about half the population of Russia, right? Just being born in a very, very short time period. And I will say, it is a reversal and it is an oddity in the last 200 years. Basically, from the kind of middle part or the first quarter of the 19th century until today, what we've generally seen is declining birth rates, right? Birth rates getting lower over time. And the silents and their children, the boomers, are a sort of temporary reversal of that. And I think what it's done culturally is to make us think that, in the past, people had a ton of children. But really, since industrialization began, it's mostly been a story of declining birth rates with one very, especially it's sort of in living memory of our culture, one very big demographic bulge, which makes us think that, in the recent past, people still normally had a lot of children, but they largely didn't. Okay, this is what's happened and what's the boomers have been is sort of the dominant force, basically in culture, in politics, and in economics through their entire life course, right? And just to kind of, again, these charts do an interesting job of kind of illustrating this because you can see the boomers move through the life course, right? Because they're sort of the fat part, right? And this, so as they move through, they bring a big population with them. And so the boomers have mostly, especially from a political point of view, gotten more or less everything they wanted because they are a massive voting demographic, right? When they were children, politicians catered to their parents because they knew that this would eventually be a big population. And they were kind of catering to them. As they went through adulthood, their values tended to predominate because they could simply outvote other demographic cohorts because there's so many of them. And it has real implications for our future as well. Because, as you can kind of see, this is the US in 2020. In our kind of retiree years, right, our 60s plus, there's almost as many people in there as there are in the younger working, or so these are kids, but in our kind of younger cohorts, there's not that big of a difference between kind of how many boomers there are, right? People now largely in retirement, and people who are in their kind of working years. This means that some of the fundamental social bargains that have been made, things like pension, something like the CPP, Medicare, social welfare systems that were largely predicated on an idea that there would be CPP, not CPU, that there would be kind of more workers than retirees is now kind of fundamentally broken, right? If we go back to, say, when Canada Pension and Old Age Security was brought in Canada, what you basically had was about 10 workers for every retiree, right? So basically, every retiree that was getting old age security or Canada Pension had 10 workers supporting them. In Canada today, and especially as the boomers largely retire, the last of them should be moving into retirement, or the youngest of them should be moving into retirement in the next few years. we're now closer to 2 workers for every 1 retiree, right? And this has major impacts. It means you're going to pay a lot more taxes to support a bunch of old people. Hopefully you like them and you feel okay with this social bargain, because there's still a lot of them and they still have a lot of voting power. And if you try to take away their pensions or old age security, they will, vote for a politician that makes that not happen. But it means that systems like healthcare, like pension, and so forth are going to be under a ton of strain until the boomers finally shuffle off this mortal coil. So it's changed the demographics badly. Now Canada's in rough shape this way at about 2-1. Japan, I believe in the most recent kind of census, is at about 0.9 workers for every retiree. So that's bad. A lot of strain on young workers in Japan to support older people, which is going to be really tough. But that is a story for another day, possibly another class. Okay. But you'll be paying for the boomers for a good chunk of your working lives, especially since their life expectancy is pretty high on average. Okay, boomers. They internalized a lot of those changes made by the silence about values, particularly on these kind of 3 categories, right? Race, so civil rights, women's rights, right? So the women's lib movement really takes off with the boomers. And then, starting with gay and lesbian rights, and then very much moving into kind of broader rights for sexual minorities, what we today would call LGBTQ plus, or whatever name you want to give it, right? Starts with gay and lesbian rights and sort of expands from there. But the boomers are the first to sort of, internalize that this is important and think that, gay and lesbian people should be granted a lot of the rights that straight people are, right? They largely reject a lot of the, what they see as outdated prejudices of older generations and really center on individual choice as their core value, right? So we see growing individualism coming from the boomers. And yeah, they value things like breaking traditional rules, right? Especially around things like sex and not for nothing, right? Sorry, I'm trying to remember my years here. 1959 is the first year that the birth control pill officially appears. It's used initially to treat bleeding disorders in women, but by 1962, it is widely approved as a contraceptive, not without some social controversy, but mostly people are pretty happy with the idea for obvious reasons. And as the boomers, right, come into adulthood, they're in an environment of kind of much freer sexuality than their parents were. And yeah, by most boomers in 1970 said it's okay to have sex before marriage, while most silence and greatest generation said no. All right, 1967, right? So still a landscape dominated by the greatest generation and silence in adult polling, right? 85% of adults said sex before marriage is wrong. Barely a decade later, right? 12 years later, 37%, right? So it's dropped to a smallish plurality, right? A little bit more than a third. So the boomers overturn a lot of social norms, especially around things like sex. And yeah, drug use becomes much more common and acceptable, particularly marijuana, right? But the boomers also experiment with lots of other things like LSD, mushrooms, less so with things like heroin and cocaine, but there certainly are experiments in those directions as well. Okay, 10 more minutes and we'll take a break. All right, we're going to talk some key technologies. Like I said, television tends to stick around for a long time, and we'll see television with Gen X as well. But the boomers are essentially the first generation raised with television at the center of their lives, right? So most of that, like some of the older boomers will remember a time before television, right? But mostly by the time you hit the younger end of the generational cohort, they will not really remember a time when television wasn't present in their homes, right? Of course, there were some people that were poorer and couldn't afford it, but largely, people had a television. It was sort of a key piece of technology, so they all sort of grow up with it, right? So they're all mostly raised with television at the center of their lives. And again, it expands horizons. It shows a lot of things that are happening in the world. And particularly, once we get into the Vietnam War, it shows a lot of what's happening in Vietnam, including some of the atrocities, committed against civilians by the US military, and really polarizes both of those kind of younger silents and older boomers against the Vietnam War and coalesces that anti-Vietnam War movement that will lead eventually to things like the abolition of the draft, right? So the boomers are going to be our last generation in the United States who face military conscription, right? Afterwards, and once we get into the Gen X, the military after Gen X is largely made up of volunteers. The draft is abolished. Okay, so the birth control pill. Like I said, it's introduced as a contraceptive in the 1960s. I think it's officially approved as a contraceptive for women in 1962 in the US. In Canada, it's a little bit later. It's not until 1968. So Canada is 1968. The US is 1962. Now, obviously, the boomers aren't the only ones who take advantage of it, right? Women in the silent generation, excuse me, sneeze coming. Silent generation women also, take and use the birth control pill, but as a kind of whole generation and those that experience it when they're young, right? It's largely the boomers that are the first generation to really take advantage of it. And obviously, what the birth control pill does is it separates sex from conception, right? Or it separates sex and babies. So it's now much more possible for women to experiment sexually without the risk that will come with, getting pregnant, right? Which fundamentally changes their lives. And I say to a degree because, even with contraceptive technologies, and early birth control isn't perfect. Birth control today isn't perfect either. There's a lot of unplanned pregnancies that happen even with the birth control pill and other forms of contraception, which is why, right, what you get along with this eventually, and a little bit lagging from, say, birth control, is a push for abortion rights, right? As a kind of, I don't want to say second line of defense, but I just did. If contraception fails, that women have a second kind of way that they can deal with an unplanned pregnancy in this respect, right? So birth control isn't perfect. And so we'll see, right, in 1973, in the US, we get the landmark case Roe v. Wade, which will stand until basically the 2020s, enshrining abortion as a civil right for women. And in Canada, I don't remember the year, I want to say it's 1986, you get Crown v. Morgentaler, which does the same, basically enshrines abortion rights as a constitutional right, largely under the aegis of privacy. Okay, so abortion comes after the birth control pill. That increased sexual experimentation does lead to, much more demand for abortion. Okay, now the other one, I'm going to put this in a different color because these ones are really important as well. And I think often somewhat forgotten in terms of their importance. Though there's whole books written about these. and real arguments made by historians, um, that actually one of the things that liberated women more than almost anything else was not the birth control pill, it's these domestic labor saving technologies, right? Most specifically, things like the washing machine and dishwasher, but other things that made domestic work much easier, like the vacuum, right? Or if you want to do it in the British way, the Hoover, right? I don't know why I care about that, but I do. Um, right? So these labor saving devices that are in the home, also really key technologies. Again, the silents will experience them a little bit later in adulthood, but the boomers, kind of grow up expecting these things to be there, and it changes their relationship to the home. And what it does basically is a lot of the work of women prior to this had been the work of what you would call, if you were a Marxist, social reproduction, right? Your job was to basically cook meals, clean, take care of the home, and allow workers to then go to work the next day. And a lot of these things, prior to the invention of these labor saving devices, were really time consuming and difficult, right? And I remember, my mom, born in 1951, grew up on a relatively poor farm in northern Alberta. So she remembers her mom like hand washing clothes, right? And basically, there's a couple of versions of this, but the first one is, basically a bin of soapy water and a scrubbing board, and actually just scrubbing clothes manually on a scrubbing board. And, my mom came from a family of 14 children, a little bit unusual, but not for French Canadian farmers in northern Alberta. But, my grandma would have spent a disproportionate amount of time scrubbing clothes. Eventually, sort of a hand cranked um, washing machine came, and eventually an electrified one, right? Which made my grandma's life a whole lot easier, right? Suddenly, instead of spending hours scrubbing clothes, you just throw it in the washing machine, turn it on and walk away, right? And when it's done in about an hour or whatever it takes, right? I don't know how efficient early washing machines were. Maybe it took longer than an hour. Um, the clothes is clean. You either hang them to dry or you put them in the dryer. Um, but you got all of that time back. Same thing with the dishwasher, right? Instead of sitting there and washing dishes by hand, you shove them in the dishwasher, set the dishwasher to go, and you have that time back. And cumulatively, what all of this time does is makes it so that women need way less time on domestic tasks than prior generations, right? Coupled with improvements in manufacturing, right? So things like making clothes become much less common. Clothes become very cheap, right, to purchase, especially, in the mid 20th century, from catalogs from places like Sears, Eaton's, and the Bay in Canada, right? Sears, I'm sure there's another department store in the US that I can't think of, but places like that, right? They had catalogs that you could order clothes from relatively cheaply. Along with rising wages, now women weren't sewing clothes as much, right? And so they get all of this time back, all of the time that used to be about running and that was necessary to keep the home running, they get back. And right, you don't have to take the carpet out and beat it outside. You can just hoover it, and you're off to the races, right? All of this frees up a ton of time. And what do women put that time to? Largely, they go to work, right? They go back into the workplace once their children are in school. Um, and yeah, they essentially go back into the labor force, and the rates of labor participation increase, basically. And I think not entirely because of, but in large part because of these labor saving technologies that make that possible. Okay, let's pause because I need to refill my tea. I'll see if I can cool the lava off a little more quickly. So we'll pause here for a couple of minutes. Let's say, is 20 good? Can you more than 20? 20? Okay. Let's come back at like 42, because by the time I shut up, it'll be, yeah, 22. So come back at 42, and we will keep going from there.
Oh, dear. Like, sure. Because I'm like starting to cleanse and to fix something. I always feel like I'm prepared. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think I'll look at another dimension. I've been in that sort of thing. Like, I'm not so gonna like, yeah, begin quality because I did it. I think it's going to be Yeah, it's just, I, yeah. But it is. Yeah. 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 Oh, yeah. Yeah. I think it's like five. Oh, actually, it's still good. But they are both like big. Yeah. Like, I was thinking, I really feel. No, like how everything's I think not interesting, but it's something really. But it's also and when you look at it's difficult. Perfect. Yeah, oh, it's really upset. It's sorry. Me too. Me too. It's not anything. Energy is really fast. It's you're being by I like cherry. Yeah. I asked my friends to get those paths right with it. Oh, it's good. I think right. Everyone just goes. Everyone said that to take this one. And that's not really fun. Because we look for basic. I don't know why you say, no, I don't. I saw there was a service. It was very odd. They're very different. Me and my friend got some yesterday. I got that charity. They're not. I think like but things are very funny. I'm trying to say like we did have so that I had a brain. So it's a good like I'm serious. You're gonna be so good. I'm actually going to do it. I have to listen. That's what it's, yeah. I got I'm sure you or something. Exactly, sure. Actually, so yeah, just how you react because sometimes you make things. There's one. I think we're trying to because I don't know what is the such a match with yes. Oh, yeah, it's not yeah, it's like the big like bro. Like I like three things. Shoot. Yeah, it's like I'm just not when I was like in the like check I was like it's like what did I say? Oh my god. Like some boy crazy. Yeah, I'm great. What's the problem? I don't make it like wait, is it it's not like growing takes I think it's like in the movie okay, so is there not it's so good. But got me to no, they're kind of not. Some people told me that I actually never heard that. You would take it. Yeah, but they're being, yeah, I'm sorry, maybe but yeah, like, well, it's, yeah, it's not one thing. And then for me, it's in that adventure thing. Yeah. After this. And it's just
Okay, let's, I guess we'll start again here. Okay, so we got one more slide. I should have just finished the boomers before we stopped, but foolishly I didn't. And then we're going to talk Gen X and hopefully millennials in the next hour or so. Okay, so our boomers, right? Kind of established they are more individualistic than some of our other generational cohorts have been prior, right? So our silence. And yeah, rejecting social rules, including rules around things like sexuality, is a big part of the boomer landscape. Okay, so once they are kind of out of their very formative years, right? Out of their teens and 20s, some of that chaotic boomer energy that had been, I should turn my subtitles back on. Yeah, some of that kind of boomer energy, which had been very much geared towards overturning social norms, starts to slowly shift. And no generation is ever going to stay in that sort of anti-establishment moment forever. Once they grow, they get jobs, they settle down a little bit, they tend to become much more normative, I guess, if you will. And what happens with the boomers is they shift sometime in the late 70s and the early 1980s away from sort of like fight the man towards more of a kind of quest for self-discovery, right? So they really go into things like self-help, right? Self-help becomes a big thing for the boomers, right? And therapy culture, and working on themselves and discovering who they are, right? These are all things that very much come out of the boomers. Now, this will have consequences later down the road as well, because in large part, the boomers are the parents of a lot of the millennials, right? And the millennials, as Twengi talks about in her book, Generation Me, are very much kind of focused on themselves as individuals, as what defines them, what makes them different, right? That and like we'll see, they very much come to be focused on themselves as a very special and important person. And we have some really interesting statistical data to back that up. And this seems to largely come from how they are raised, right? How the values that the boomers instill in them, right? So the boomers are going through this in the 1980s, and our millennials, I'm scared to right at the top, our millennials, our years are roughly 1980 to 1994, 1995. So right in there, right, as the boomers are going through this self-discovery phase and this self-help phase, they're raising kids who are also going to internalize a lot of these values. More on that later. Okay. Now, in a lot of ways, their kind of anti-establishment sort of vibe doesn't really seem to help the boomers in terms of mental health, right? So they report, struggling with mental health issues at 2 or 3 times more than the silents did at the same age, right? And this has been pretty consistent through their whole lives, right? So it started in their college years, and it has persisted into their late 70s, right? Where some of the older boomers now are. I guess a few of them now have kind of rolled into their early 80s. Suicide rates for the boomers are way higher than they are for the silents, right? An American born in that last boomer year was 35% more likely to take their own life than a silent born kind of in the middle of the silent demographic, right? So, and again, born during the Great Depression, and then coming of age in the post-war era. Okay, now, as they've gone older, and I know we're not talking about youth anymore, but I think it's worth mentioning that some of the trends and some of the things that start in youth carry forward as people get older. We coin a new term for what happens to a lot of the boomers in middle age, and this is deaths of despair, right? And here we have three kind of things that we class as deaths of despair: suicide, overdose, and liver failure, right? The liver failure typically caused by alcoholism. And yeah, we see this increase a lot in the boomers as they're in that 45 to 54 demographic, right? Mostly at first amongst white working class people. But once they hit kind of, retirement age or later midlife, I guess, what you'd call it, 55 to 64, the death rate for the boomers rises, right, considerably, especially compared to older demographics, despite the fact that with better treatments, rates of cancer and heart disease actually are declining. So they actually are dying at higher numbers, and those deaths of despair, again, play a big part in that. And we can only speculate, right, what is causing this. But Twenge sort of says it's largely probably due to less stable relationships, fewer children, less social connection, so they're less integrated into communities, meaning that they are lonelier. And loneliness, right, certainly this is a discourse that started in the last few years. People are talking about loneliness as probably the next big epidemic. Not that it's an actual disease, but that as society grows more disconnected, more people are finding it hard to connect, and they're so lonely that they abuse drugs, they abuse alcohol, or they may take their own lives. Okay. Now, our Gen Xers. So this is our next cohort of people. And again, these are the children, of a lot of the kind of split between the silents and some of the older baby boomers, right? Those are their parents. The silents born 1965 to 1979. Okay, so they are, television, again, present for them since birth. And the technology takes a kind of interesting turn when Gen Xers are relatively young. You get the introduction of cable TV, right? So cable TV starts this transition to a lot more variety of kind of cultural entertainment, and a lot less standardization. But for the most part, the world that the Gen Xers inhabit is one really dominated by, in Canada, sort of three TV networks, which would be CBC, CTV, and then a bunch of independent stations, which eventually will become global at the end of the 1990s. So you have kind of three typical networks that you could access. In Edmonton, it was, Channel 8, ITV, was the independent station. And obviously, like, if you had cable, who does anymore? I guess my parents still do. I don't know why. All they complain about all the time, there's nothing on cable, we should cancel it. They've literally been saying this for 15 years. One day they might actually do it. Right, so there's three networks, and then the US, right, so that's Canada. The US had similarly a three-network structure. CBS, almost wrote CBC again, ABC, and NBC, with the later addition of Fox, right? Okay, so kind of relatively small selections. As they get older and cable comes in, this selection grows bigger, but they still have relatively limited cultural experiences, right? As compared to later generations, and certainly millennials and Gen Z, that have things like streaming. Okay, largely they're considered the last generation to have an analog rather than a digital childhood, just meaning that things like the internet, for the most part, video games, And then other forms of digital entertainment, certainly social media, right, are not present when they are particularly young, right? They're going to experience a lot of these technologies later into their 20s and more in their 30s, right? So they've already passed those kind of formative years. And in a lot of ways, this seems to make them a weirdly healthy generation. Lots of people are now looking at Gen X and particularly the way they were raised and noting how independent it made them, right? And far less, far more resilient than, say, some of the later generations. Okay, in the US, right, and I mentioned this before, they're the first generation that doesn't face compulsory military service, right? The draft is abolished after the end of the Vietnam War and all of the problems that war caused politically in the US. So they go to an all-volunteer army. So the Gen Xers are the first generation really to grow up in a time where, they're not expected or even worried about participating in the military, right? So that part of civic life sort of becomes the purview largely of, well, for a long time, the white working class in poor regions of the country, the South, and the kind of Midwest, Appalachia kind of region. Poor white people will make up the bulk of the U.S. military, but for a lot of the middle class, right, joining the military never crosses their minds, and they don't have to do any kind of military service. Okay, they also grow up kind of at the height of the Cold War, when tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union are at a particularly high pitch, right? They've, just gone through things like the Cuban Missile Crisis and a sort of detente under Khrushchev is now well in with the Soviet Union under Khrushchev is well in the rear window. And there's this kind of low-level tension between the United States and the Soviet Union that threatens to kind of blow up at any time into a full-on nuclear exchange, right? So they grow up with this kind of constant fear that the world might end, and there's lots of films and television, depicting what would happen after a nuclear holocaust, and this is a kind of fear in the back of the minds of a lot of Gen Xers, right? So it's in some ways a generation with a lot of anxiety about what might happen. Okay. Now this point, and I'll say related to this kind of 3 or 4 network era, Gen Xers grow up, and they're probably the last generation that can say this, in a time of relative cultural uniformity, right? Where essentially, because of the limited selection of cultural material available, people from that generation will largely have a set of shared cultural touchstones, right? So, just for example, right, and I'm a little younger than Gen Xers, right? I'm born in 1982, so just kind of after this generation. But even, as I'm going through school, the big thing was the show, which amazingly is still on the air, The Simpsons, right? And what would happen is The Simpsons aired on Fox on Sunday night. And what we would all do on Monday morning is gather, around lockers and talk about what was on The Simpsons the other night, right? Because everybody sort of had these shared cultural touchstones. Everybody was watching the same thing because there was only limited numbers of shows available, right? And this is why, for kind of Gen Xers and a lot of older millennials, the sitcom Friends remains this like really critical cultural touchstone because a lot of people watched it, or Seinfeld, right? A lot of millennials really resonate with Seinfeld because they were all watching it every week when it came out. Now, as we move forward, right, with younger millennials and then Gen Z, the proliferation of first cable, which not everybody could afford, but which offered a whole variety of different shows. I'm just thinking back now. I'm having like flashbacks to my youth. And it was like before The Simpsons, it was Star Trek: The Next Generation. So I remember all of my friends, we all would talk about what happened on Star Trek on Friday night, right? On Monday morning, we were all talking about that when I was in elementary school. This largely goes away, right, with later generations because there's so much variety that not everybody is watching the same things. So there's less kind of like shared cultural reference points, right? And you can still get a group of Gen Xers together and have them talk about all the things they watched when they were growing up, because it was all the same stuff. Okay, they're also the first, right? They get the kind of early video game systems. They're the first ones, right? Especially home video game systems with things like the Atari, the Atari 2600, I think. It doesn't matter. And later, things like the NES, Nintendo Entertainment System, and then SNES, Super Nintendo, and Sega Genesis, right? All being these very popular home consoles that allowed people to play video games at home. There were also, video arcades, right, where people would go and play arcade games for hours at a time. There used to be like 3 of these in West Edmonton Mall. I grew up not too far from West Edmonton Mall, and so I remember like when I was in junior high and high school, there's these huge arcades where you could go play, whatever the big games of the time were that weren't available on home consoles. Okay, now lots of cultural changes too. Maybe I'll put this in. Let's put this in red for no particular reason, because it stands out. Children who experience, so basically, Gen Xers were the first generation really to experience particularly high rates of divorce amongst their parents, largely because, divorce laws are amended in Canada and in the US at roughly the same time. In Canada, we get the Divorce Act amended in 1968 to make divorce considerably easier. But the big jump comes in 1985 with further amendment under the government of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, further amendments to the Divorce Act to bring in particularly no-fault divorce, which basically allowed people to divorce after a period of 1 year of separation without having to give reasons of adultery or cruelty, right? And after 1985, divorce rates spike pretty massively in both Canada and the US with these kinds of laws. Okay, I'm going to erase all this junk. And here, this one's important. And this, lots of people, and certainly I think someone will talk about later in the course in Jonathan Haidt, didn't spell his name right. H-A-I-D-T, Haidt. They're the first and last of the latchkey kids in some ways, right? And this is a kind of, I guess, a cultural fear and a cultural moment that happens with Gen X, right? So what happened most typically is both parents were working, right? Most Gen Xers would have experienced, once they're in school, both their father and their mother are at work, right? And especially moms, largely return to work when their kids enter school, full-time schooling, right? So once their last kid enters the first grade. Things like stay-at-home moms become rarer and rarer after this point. And so what happens is a lot of these kids from relatively young ages, right, as young as sometimes the first grade, are allowed to walk home from school. They have a key, they unlock the door, they head inside, they get themselves a snack, they plant themselves in front of the TV, and they watch TV until their parents get home, right? At which point they're either shuttled off to activities or kicked outside to go play outside, or whatever it happens to be, right? So they're latchkey kids because they had the key to the latch on the house, right? This causes a lot of interesting kind of cultural panics, especially amongst conservatives, where latchkey kids are seen as, bad, right? It's especially mothers are blamed for returning to work and thus leaving their children to their own devices. Amongst other things that we do see, which is probably a result of less supervision, is a real kind of decline in the age at which people have their first sexual encounters, and pretty high teen pregnancy rates amongst Gen Xers. So teen pregnancies become a big concern for this generation because largely, they're unsupervised, and unsupervised teenagers will do things. Okay. All right. And this kind of goes with what's on here. Okay, now I will say one thing about the latchkey kids, and one thing that people are observing now, is that this seems to have generated a generation with a lot of independence, right? Who are deeply independent, who learned how to be self-sufficient at relatively young ages, and a lot of the parenting ethos of the silence or the late silence and the early boomers was, kick the kids outside. This is the kind of cliche for Gen Xers, is as long as you check in occasionally, come home for lunch and dinner and be home before dark, they just kind of let their kids roam around the neighborhood and play in relatively unstructured sorts of ways. And a lot of observations now are that this had some real psychological benefits for Gen Xers as they learned how to solve a lot of their own problems. Okay, now it did create some other social problems though. All right, so marriage, sex, and children, not necessarily in that order. And what Twenge observes is that Gen Xers, again, driven a lot by the values of their parents, tend to see sex before marriage as quite normal, and which I think is true of all the generations after the boomers. But they in particular, she says, had a short childhood and a really long adolescence, right? So they, things like they tended to become sexually active quite early, right? Some of them as early as 12 and 13. That wasn't the norm. Kind of 15, 16 is typically more normal. And that means a pretty long adolescence, right? From like 13 to, well into their 20s and 30s when they actually start to settle down, right? So you see the difference, compared especially to the silence. The age at first marriage, right, starts to climb with this generation. For women, it's at about 25 for Gen Xers. For men, it's at about 27, right? And marriage is a big kind of marker that sort of your young adult life, your, adolescence or emerging adulthood is sort of at an end, because then you're settling into more conventional kind of institutions. The gap between things like, becoming sexually active and getting married shifted. It was longer for Gen Xers, right? For early boomer women, they had sex only about 2 years before they got married, right? It was 7 for Gen Xers, right? So that time starts to get longer and longer. And again, this is a trend that continues on with millennials and then kind of goes a different direction with Gen Z. Not because Gen Z is particularly prudish, just because they start having sex later as well. All right. And the kind of order of life, right? What would have been expected for Gen Xer, or not Gen Xer, sorry, for silence and for boomers was that you would, basically, have children after you got married, sort of falls apart with Gen X. So in the 1960s, right, when the Gen Xers are just babies still, it's something around 1 in 20 children are born to unwed mothers. By the time the older Gen Xers are in adolescence, right, and early adulthood, it's 1 in 6. By the time they are, kind of that dominant kind of young adult cohort, it's 1 in 3, right? So huge shifts in kind of marriage. Now, a lot of them will eventually get married, but often after they have their first child, right? And here, the two lines kind of cross. The age of the mother at the birth of her first child ends up being, on average, is younger than the age at first marriage, right? So more people are having children without getting married amongst Gen Xers than any generation prior. What's my favorite Star Trek? What a truly pertinent question. No, it's lovely. This is the geekiest thing. My favorite Star Trek is 100% Star Trek Deep Space Nine, which I still think is the finest Star Trek series ever made. I have real affection for Star Trek The Next Generation. Lower Decks, the kind of animated one that came out recently, I really liked it. If you want to hear a 45-minute rant about the terrible state of Star Trek, talk to me about Star Trek Starfleet Academy. The most recent one, which was pure unadulterated garbage. My daughter, who also loves Star Trek because she is my mini-me, got through about 20 minutes of it. She's 16, but she's still my mini-me. She got through 20 minutes of it and was like, this is so cringe, I can't even watch it. My son made it through 7 episodes, relentlessly mocking it before we both gave up. It's bad. Okay, perfect. But DS9 is classic Trek, and it's the best. I love Garrick. And if you understand that reference, I love you. Okay, so self-help. This same trend that started with the boomers in the 80s really continues on with Gen X, right? Loving yourself and self-help are big trends amongst Gen X. Excuse me. And kids during this generation, right, are taught that self-esteem is paramount, right? And all of the parenting trends shift towards questions of self-esteem. I love this, right? So this is from a great longitudinal sample, right? This isn't it. This is self-help trends. But this data comes from a big longitudinal data set called Monitoring the Future, where they've been asking people young people questions, going back into the 1950s. In the early 1950s, on Monitoring the Future, I love American data. They have so much good data. I wish Canada had as good of data as the Americans do. 12% of teens agreed with the statement, I am an important person. By the late 1980s, right, when you've got a good chunk of Gen X in there, 80% of teens said that they were an important person, right? So obviously, a sense of your own importance had really sort of bubbled up by this point. And then we get the millennials, right, which is just a generation, according to Twenge, of pure narcissists. Okay. What else happens to Gen X? So, they become much more materialistic, right? And I say there's sort of a culmination of a growing desire for unabashed materialism, right? The silents certainly became more materialistic to some extent, right? They gathered more things, they owned a lot more stuff. The boomers, because they got super wealthy, they lived through a time of great abundance, they were really entrenched in the economy even before it slowed down. They acquire a lot of stuff, right? Boats and RVs and second houses and all of that. And it's from there that the Gen Xers sort of get a lot of this value. They want stuff. Life goals shift from intrinsic goals, meaning ideas and helping other, to extrinsic ones. Fame. I combined money and fame to MAME. Okay, it's time for class to end maybe. Fame, money, image, right? And yeah, you kind of see it in this chart, right? So this is asking students basically what they are to consider certain life goals as important, right? So what do they want to do? And this is incoming college students, and this is the American Freshman Survey, which again is a data set that we have going back to like the 1950s, I think, or maybe the 1960s, which has been asking similar questions to college freshmen in the U.S., for basically 80 years, which I think is amazing. And I love American data for this reason. But what happens, right, is you get this kind of crossover point somewhere in the boomers, right? Where prior to the boomers, what were people going to college for? They were going to develop a meaningful philosophy of life, right? To learn things, to encounter things like philosophy, classic literature, to come up with whatever else is, like Western civilization courses were very, very big in this point in history. And what happens is somewhere right around here, right? So we're talking, kind of in the late 1970s, that gets overtaken by something which used to be much less popular, which was being financially well off, right? And so you see a kind of growing materialism, right? People shift from wanting to develop a meaningful philosophy of life to really education becomes a goal not of being a well-rounded person or understanding the world or having a philosophy, but it becomes about getting a good job and being able to get stuff, right? And this trend, and we'll talk about it when we get to education as well, has only accelerated with millennials and Gen Z, right? Where basically now education is very much a means to that particular end, which is material success. Okay. This is a slightly hard chart to read, so I won't belabor it. But basically, right, this is at different ages, percentage of US adults with depression, right? So what do we see? So at age 56 to 74, right? The silence back in 2009 had very low rates of depression. And what do we see as we move away from the silence into the boomers, right? Much higher rates of depression. When the boomers were in their 41 to 55 age, basically they were much more likely to report depression, and it goes down a little bit for Gen X, right? As we get into Gen X and they're in their middle age era, less likely to say that they're depressed. And Gen Xers, when they were in their, 26 to 40, right? So late emerging adult years into middle age, pretty unlikely to say that they were depressed. But as we get millennials moving in here, much higher rates, I guess like 3 points more likely to say that they are, depressed. Okay, so what to make of all of this? Early on, it sort of seemed like Gen X wasn't doing very well. Often seen as a pretty nihilistic generation when they were young. Right? They had nearly double the rates of suicide in their teens compared to boomers, right? Now, as they've gotten older, their mental health has actually improved. But what may have happened here is actually this number is probably misleading. Because what it kind of goes along with, and we don't see similar trends in Canada or in kind of places like the UK, what seems to have happened here is that kind of adolescence for Gen Xers went along with liberalization of gun laws in the US. So gun laws got much looser in the US right around the time that Gen Xers were adolescents, which meant there were a lot more guns floating around. And the thing that happens is guns are a much more, sad to say, effective means of taking your own life. And so the fact that there were more guns around probably explains why Gen Xers took their lives at a higher rate than boomers did, even though later on, we come to think that their mental health is significantly better. Okay.
So on the last slide, it says that they generally have better mental health as adults, but the graph shows the 26 to 40 age range being the lesser depressed one than 41 to 55 for Gen X.
Yeah, I mean, better than the boomers, right? So as you move into middle age, the preview, this is not going to be great. Rates of depression do tend to come up. You're sort of, shall we say, crushed a little bit by life. But it's still a bit lower than it was for the boomers, right? Nothing like the silence. The silence are just like at a low ebb all the time. But yeah, they do a little bit better than compared to the boomers at the same time in their lives, right? So they're less depressed than their older counterparts. Does that make sense? Okay. I know this is a really confusing chart. It's not the most straightforward to read. Took me a while even. Okay. So I'll make these 3 points and I'll show you on the graphs. And I've discovered a fancy trick for zooming in, which took me years to figure out. It's all about hovering. Okay. Social fabric, right? Social fabric generally breaks down when trust is low. And one of the things that seems to categorize Gen Xers in particular has been or was declining social trust. And what Twenge suggests is that this might have been driven by a couple of things. High crime rates in the 1980s, right, leading to less social trust in general. After the 1980s, crime rates decline pretty considerably in Canada and the US. There's different explanations, but that's for a criminology class. We won't talk about it today. There's lots of interesting explanations for why that happened. Rising in inequality, right? Income inequality really starts to rise sharply after 1973, but especially after 1980, when you have what's kind of typically referred to as the neoliberal turn, and you get more neoliberal governance from people like Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and then in Canada, Brian Mulroney and Jean Chrétien, all basically rule in a more kind of neoliberal direction, prioritizing corporate profits more than, say, social programs. Okay, with that said, I discovered that if I click here, I lose the magnifying glass, but if I hover, I can use the magnifying glass. Okay, so let's look at these charts. All right, so what do we have here? So this is monitoring the future. Again, a really great kind of longitudinal study that's been running, I think, since the 50s. But here, Twenge's charted out data going back to the 1970s. And what does it show, right? So this gray area is when, we have mostly Gen X in the kind of young adult sample, right? So these are US 12th graders expressing trust in others. And what we see, right, is basically, one of the questions, would you say that most of the time people try to be helpful? And you see that basically prior to Gen X coming in, it was, about a third of the sample. And by the time, it said they were, most of the time people try to be helpful. At its kind of low point, it drops to kind of about 23%. I can't write on the slides when I'm zoomed in. PowerPoint doesn't have all the magic. Right? Trust. What's the trust question? Do you think most people would try to take advantage of you if they got the chance, or would they be fair? And basically, again, a plurality, right? About 33% at the prior to Gen Xers coming in thought that people would try to be helpful rather than taking advantage, and that number crashes, when Gen X is in the sample and never recovers, right? Millennials and Gen Z continue to think that people aren't going to be helpful. And the last one, generally, would you say that most people can be trusted, or that you can't be too careful dealing with people, right? And again, relatively high, somewhere around 30% prior to Gen X coming into the sample, and then it crashes and again, never makes a recovery. Okay, other chart. I'm going to have way too much fun with this zoom into charts thing. And now you can see the charts, they're not tiny, so I can put way more charts per slide. My chart per slide ratio is going to go way up. That will worry anyone who's going to take sociology of religion, because I love charts. Okay, 12th graders expressing trust in government. And again, it didn't dip as far, but you see that basically by the time you kind of go through Gen Xers, it's dropped from right around kind of high 80s to around 80%, right? And it bottoms out kind of, over here, right around kind of 75, 76%, right? Government run for the people versus by big interest, or for big interests, right? Again, that's at about 70%. By the time Gen X exits the sample, it's dropped into the kind of low 60s. It jumps up a little bit after that for millennials, and then once we get Gen Z, right, it starts to crash, and it's moving outside of majority territory, right, into most people thinking, maybe realistically, that the government is run for big interests. I love this one. The people running government are honest, and I think it's adorable that, like, at some point, almost 70% of people thought that this was true, and that it crashes, boom. By 1992, it's like under 40%. Recovers a little bit for the millennials. They almost crack 50%, and then it just tanks again. And by the time we get to Gen Z, right around here, right, it's below 30%. of people who think people running the government are honest. So yes, the wisdom of the young. There, I'm not even being sarcastic. Okay, and here it's just mapped, right? Income inequality in black. So we have and this is a Gini index. Is this Gini index? No, Gini index is a 1 to -1. I don't know what index this is actually, or what measurement it's using. Not Gini coefficient, something else. Basically, right, we have income inequality rated from -2 to 2, and lack of social trust. And you see that they kind of move together, right, as, though not exactly, as income inequality has grown, so has lack of social trust grown at the same time. All right, Shazam, zoom out. Haha, love it. Okay. How are we doing here? I'm way too amused by the subtitles. I keep glancing at them and see if it gets like Shazam. I like it. Okay, millennials. Clearly the best of all generations. I say that as a millennial. No one will ever beat us. We will always be the best. Okay, so most of the millennials, right, grow up with the internet as a pervasive part of their lives. So in rough terms, right, the year that, basically, and it differs from place to place, but the years where the internet sort of went mainstream and went from sort of a specialized thing used by researchers and the military to something used by regular everyday consumers is somewhere between 1993 and 1995, right? By 1995, everybody thinks the internet is super important. Schools start to get wired into the internet, right? Schools get internet access, largely broadband. By the end of the 1990s, we move away from dial-up internet to things like cable and eventually ADSL, which is through the phone system, but still high speed. And most of the millennials, right? So if you're born in 1980, you're one of the oldest millennials, you'll remember a world before the internet, right? I remember a world before the internet. I remember the internet coming into the market. You're about 13 to 15, kind of roughly, when the internet starts to really come in. But for anyone younger than that, right, largely, and certainly by the end of this generational cohort, the internet is just the norm. It's part of the social landscape. It's always been there. There's never really been a time without it. And so often millennials, especially when they were younger, this term doesn't get thrown around as much anymore. Millennials were called the first digital natives, right? The first people to grow up in the kind of internet era with the internet as a part of their lives. I don't know, maybe Gen Z will now kind of laugh at that and think of millennials as kind of hapless when it comes to, social media and such. But, at the time, millennials were seen as very much as digital natives. Okay, so yeah, they have a digital, in a lot of ways, rather than analog childhood, right? So the internet's present, things like home consoles, gaming on computers, especially online gaming, becomes much, much more normal, right? When a large chunk of this generation is quite young, you get things like the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3 that bring kind of internet gaming to the home. So it becomes very normal. And they're the first generation to experience social media, though mostly as young adults, right? So we get things like, there's MySpace prior to, say, Facebook, but Facebook really hits the market in a big way in around 2005, and it's the first social media site to really make big inroads. And it's so funny because Facebook then and Facebook today are almost completely different. But yeah, they're the first ones to really experience it, right? And by 2005, a lot of them are kind of in their early 20s. But then the younger part of that cohort, right, is maybe 10, right, when social media really comes in. So they will experience it as they're growing up. and experienced the rise of things like Instagram, Snapchat, YouTube in major ways. Okay, they're pretty highly educated as it goes. 1 in 3 millennials have a 4-year college degree, right, which is the highest percentage of any generation up to that point. And they do relatively well financially, though it takes them a little bit longer to get started, right? So basically, millennials are constantly complaining about being behind economically. It's really not true, and I have more on that in a sec. They start later because they spend more time getting educated, but by 2019, they're earning more on average than the previous generations did at the same point in their life, adjusted for inflation. Yeah, 2016, different story. Right, so 34% they're less wealthy, right? Because they started later, so they have less assets than previous generations at the same age in 2016. But they catch up relatively quickly, right? By 2019, it's only 11% less, and today they're a little bit ahead in a lot of cases of where Gen Xers and Boomers were at the same points in their lives. But yeah, it's basically because they spent longer in school, so it took them a little while to catch up, but that education has meant they earn more on average. Okay, I need to clear that. I get excited when I see questions. Okay. Millennials, not actually poor, though they complain about, being poor and the high cost of living and all of that sort of endlessly. They actually do pretty well, right? They earn relatively high wages, especially because they're pretty educated. That said, they do face a bunch of things. Yes, cost of living is higher, especially post-COVID. They have more college debt, especially in the US, less so in Canada. But what seems to really cause millennials a bunch of heartache is really, really high expectations, right? Perceived, I have Keeping Up with the Kardashians, even though it's been off the air for a little while. Keeping Up with the Kardashians, a perceived sense that they're falling behind, they're behind where their parents were. And especially social media seems to play a role where they observe their friends, and relatives who are posting, fabulous things on their social media pages that they feel like they are missing out on, right? Tropical vacations and such. Okay. Now, millennials are probably a good example of a slow life kind of generation. And what we see for millennials, and again, we see this even though our Gen Zers are now just rounding into their 30s, the oldest of them, I think we're seeing similar trends in Gen Z. Average age of marriage, right? So one of the big milestones for adulthood, considerably later than it was for any past generation, right? Average age at first marriage for women is around 28, and it's around 30 years old for men. About 1 in 4 millennial women had never been married by their late 30s. And again, nothing wrong with that, but it's a big difference. It was only about 1 in 18 for the boomers. So considerably more millennial women never married by their late 30s. About 30% of men in their 30s were never married. And again, about double the number compared to the boomers, right? So definitely not getting married is something that is on the rise. And yeah, lots of experts now think that about 20% of millennial women will never get married, and probably a higher percentage of Gen Z women as well. Now, both, there's a preference against getting married that's growing, but also, just a lot of other things kind of pushing marriage into the background. Okay. It's not just marriage, though. The percentage, of kind of millennials when they were 25 to 34 living with a partner also declined, right? So basically, a lot of them are either living alone or living with roommates. They're not with a romantic partner. And, fertility, millennials, and now, the older part of the cohort now is exiting kind of the, what you would call the fertile window, which is somewhere around 15 to 44 for women. So we can say, I think, pretty definitively that millennials will have had the lowest number of children of any generation, kind of in living memory. And again, Gen Z is likely to follow here as well. And again, this largely seems to be driven by sort of the slow movement through the life course compared to other generations. The average age of a mother at the birth of her first child, for mothers born in the early 90s, right, so right in the middle of that millennial, or kind of later on in that millennial cohort, was 27. And what this means, right, is you just have less time, sort of, especially for women, at peak fertility, right? Women will have the easiest time getting pregnant somewhere, between 18 and about 28, after which it becomes considerably more difficult to get pregnant. By the time you hit your 30s, right, much more difficult, which is why we've seen such a huge boom in fertility treatments as millennials who've waited longer in life to get married and then have children, try to have children and struggle with it. And yeah, slow life, and especially a lot of education, a focus on, and we'll talk about it when we talk about families, a focus on marriage and children as a capstone rather than as a foundational part of life, are all probably the likely causes here. Regardless, right, what we're seeing is big declines. And here, I won't zoom in on these ones. We just see, right, our percentage of never married has grown sharply. Our percentage of never married. Okay, what are you doing? I don't even know what happened there. Shut. Our percentage of married has been going down over time, right? Okay. So, what is this? Percentage of 25 to 39-year-olds who are married by generation, right? And what do we see? Just a general decline generation on generation. And yeah, living with a romantic partner, still the majority position, right? But has dropped from like 80% in 1965 in amongst 25 to 34-year-olds down to, just above 50%, right? So trending into a minority territory, and things like alone or with a roommate or living with parents have seen sort of steady growth. Okay. Amongst other trends, when we talk about our millennials, we've seen a decline in kind of religiosity, right, or lots of markers of religion. I'll talk about that a little bit later, but particularly we've seen a growth in a category often referred to as the nuns, right? NONES, right? Nothing in particular or no religion, right? Fewer people are doing things, as we move forward, and the millennials were particularly notable for this. Because as they were going through adolescence and young adulthood, all sorts of religious markers kind of crashed. But yeah, they pray less, they believe in God less, and they're less likely to say the Bible is the inspired word of God. And of course, less likely to attend religious services, believe in God, or ever pray compared to other cohorts, right? And when we get into, there's still majority positions, right? Because we're talking, the bottom of this chart is 60%, but still way, way less than older generational cohorts. And in some cases, right, though this is actually, I think, interestingly reversing in recent years, because this data is a couple of years old now, it goes to 2018, after which some weird stuff happens. Maybe more on that later. But yeah, less likely than Gen Z to believe in God or attend services. But that could also be explained by the fact that Gen Z, a little bit, obviously they're younger, and as you go through your kind of late teens and 20s, some of that stuff falls off in general. Okay. All right. How much time do I have? Millennials, what are they like? What I will say about millennials, this section is kind of longish. maybe I'm obsessed with myself. I don't know. One of the things that's really great about millennials is I'm one of, no. One of the most wonderful things about millennials is I'm one. We have a ton of data on millennials, right? And especially because a lot of youth research really popped in the kind of late 90s and early 2000s when the millennials were young. So I would say compared to like the boomers when they were young, and I mean the tools got a lot better too, right, with the internet. But people really, really focused on teenagers and emerging adults right around the time that millennials were in that category. And one of the best studies on this was one of my favorites, which is the National Study of Youth and Religion that came out of University of Notre Dame. One of my favorite sociologists of all time, Christian Smith. And again, if you've taken any classes with me, you'll get tired of hearing about Christian Smith because I talk about him way too much. He was the kind of lead on this project where they looked at, particularly, it was about religion, but they got all sorts of interesting measures of millennials when they were going from like 13 all the way, basically to 31 by the time the study ended. So they tracked them all through their teen and emerging adult years. Okay, this information comes out of the second book in that big study. It was called Lives in Transition. Oops. Can't write at the top of the slide. Lives in Transition, about the millennials as they went from being teenagers to emerging adults. Okay, so what were the millennials like when they were young? And I think a lot of this carries through to the present. According to Smith and his co-author Patricia Snell, they were among the more optimistic generations. Generally, and this again contrasts really interestingly to the real pessimism of Gen Z. Focused on the future, and the future was bright. They knew they weren't where they wanted to be, but they thought they would get there. Now, some minority, somewhere around 15% of them, said that they knew that it was normal to be optimistic, but they struggled to be optimistic. And that's not because millennials didn't have hard lives. It just, again, seems to be sort of the zeitgeist for millennials. Their kind of cultural norm was a sort of optimism, right? Optimism was in the air. And it probably has a lot to do with the time that they were young, right? It's sort of right after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The world is in a rare moment of relative peace. There's no big enemies. People like Francis Fukuyama are talking about the end of history. Man, it got Fukuyama right. So impressed. Are talking about like the end of history, how liberal democracy and capitalism are going to rule the world forever. It was a period where everybody thought, the internet was new, the world was just going to keep getting better and better. And we know that turned out perfectly. Then we got George W. Bush, and then things went very wrong. Won't even talk about the more recent ones. Okay. Most millennials, right? Very forward-looking, especially when they were young, right? Here's some things that were pretty common for them. Things that happened in the past, that's the past, right? They weren't weighing millennials down. And a very common refrain amongst millennials is that they have no regrets, right? That basically, even when bad things happen or they were responsible for things that happened to them, right, they didn't dwell on them. And the kind of typical millennial ethos is that, the things that have happened to me, right, and you can see it on that bottom point, whatever they were, they made me who I am, right? So I have no regrets, even bad things, even the breakups, even, parents or friends dying, right? They shape them so they don't regret them, right? It's all kind of, part of discovering who I am or being who I am. And Smith notes that no regrets tends to put a sunny face on difficult matters to keep life moving forward, right? So millennials are kind of like sharks, got to keep moving forward or they drown. It's probably not the most flattering comparison. Fish are friends, not food. Okay. here, I don't have it written on the slides, but I want you to note postmodernism as being really important on this slide, even though it's just a funny little graphic. Millennials, right, in terms of their worldview. What Smith and Snell noted is that basically they're deeply postmodern in the sense that they are skeptics about the possibility of objective truth. And obviously, they're writing at a particular point in history, but I think this continues to be true about millennials, right? The view is that you can only know your own perspective, right? So all you can know is your subjective self. You really are limited by that. And so making objective moral claims, right, that there's some kind of perfect good out there or some kind of outside objective standard against which you can measure your actions is something that makes millennials deeply uncomfortable. This is so deeply ingrained in millennials that what Smith and Snell said, because they did about, at this point, I think it's about 280 interviews with millennials from across the 48 contiguous U.S. states. They asked them about, questions about morality and whether morality was based on objective or universal qualities or standards, right? So if there's some kind of external standards. And what the interviewers found was that many, if not most, could not understand what the interviewers were trying to ask. The idea of objective moral standards simply doesn't make sense to millennials. I love this quote from the book. It seems that they cannot, for whatever reason, believe in or sometimes even conceive of a given objective truth, fact, or reality, or nature of the world that is independent of their subjective self-experience, that in relation to which they and others might learn or be persuaded to change. So in that sense, religion's a really hard sell for millennials, right? Because religions are going to make objective truth claims, or what they claim to be objective truth claims, rather, about the world, and millennials are like, what's that? Now, that said, even though they don't have a sense of objective standards, millennials tend to think the following: right and wrong are easy to discern despite the lack of objective standards. So things like, and this comes out in the interview data, morality is common sense. You know what's right and wrong by your feelings or intuitions. Right and wrong, have been implanted in you by parents and teachers. Living morally is relatively effortless. You just do what feels right. Now, do I have this on another slide? Okay, I don't. I'll just tell you this. So one of the things that Smith and Snell suggest, and again, this goes back to this kind of postmodern point, is that postmodern philosophy from people you may have heard of in sociology, people like Michel Foucault, people like Jacques Derrida, Baudrillard, and other kind of postmodern thinkers. Even you could say people like Nietzsche, though Nietzsche is obviously a 19th century philosopher. These views have sort of these people and their philosophies have deeply shaped millennials in their understanding of the world, despite the fact that when it comes to millennials, it's not like millennials went to a big book club where they all read Foucault, Derrida, Baudrillard, Nietzsche, and all of those. Most millennials have never read these people. I count myself as the unlucky one who's read everything by these people. Like literally all of Foucault, because I had a terrible PhD supervisor who wanted to get rid of me for 6 months, and she was like, I think you should just read Foucault. And I'm like, what Foucault? She's like, all of it. I'm like, okay. So I read all of Foucault in 6 months, and I still don't know why. But I'll say this, I'm really glad he died of AIDS before he finished the history of sexuality, because 3 more volumes of the history of sexuality and I would have done myself in. So I'll say that about Foucault. I have very dark humor. I'm sorry. Anyway, most millennials, myself excluded, have never read Foucault, Derrida, or any postmodern theorist. But again, that kind of zeitgeist, postmodernism is deeply in the millennial zeitgeist, right? It's something that's kind of accepted without being understood by millennials. And having left you with a horribly dark joke, Why don't we stop there? We'll pick it up here on Monday because we have 2 minutes, and I've tormented you enough. All right, so we will see you on Monday. Have a great weekend, which always feels like a weird thing to say on a Wednesday, but I do hope you have a great weekend, and we'll see you later. You as well.